Here is 3 Oysters Americano, a brown ink. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink.
The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
This is a slightly red-leaning brown, and how red is associated with coffee, I have no idea. There is some tone variation by pen, and sometimes the red undertones are a bit much more visible. It can shade depending on the pen, but is unreliable to its shading. Now on non-fountain pen friendly paper, it tends to bring out those red undertones more, not always for the best. So I can say I like this more in its darker tones, and even though it doesn't shade there, it does look its best there, which is great. All of the writing samples are done with a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib that writes rather dry, a Hero 7035 with a fine nib that writes wet, a Visconti Van Gogh with a medium nib and an average flow, a Lamy All-Star with a broad nib that writes average.
The pen for today is a Kaweco Sport.
Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the soft fine nib, we get a mid-tone for this brown. Now, it doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it does shade, and it does it very well. This pen is really good at bringing out what flaws an ink might have, and here it's doing such a good job. It shows that a dry writing pen isn't going to hold this ink back. Just look at the shading that's going on where every word has a couple of dark letters in it. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does not shade, but it does give a great dark brown tone on the paper without any bit of the red undertones that could be there. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine. It does not feather, it does not spread. It does have some shading that are going on. You can see where it darted back for some of that darted back with the first line, where the D is a little bit lighter than the A that gets a bit darker. The T lightens up and the TED at the end does get darker again. Now back starts at a lighter tone with the BAC, but the K at the end, much darker. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, lighter than it was with the soft fine, really showing off those red undertones a whole lot. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade fairly well. Not like it's a great shader, it's not shading as well as it did with the soft fine, but it is shading, showing some darker letters like the E in slope on the second line, the he of the on the second line. It does it enough that you can say it's a shader. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle. This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There's approximately 6 milliliters of ink left. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook. Looking at the soft fine nib, it is just as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine. Shows a little bit more of those red undertones coming through here in the lighter bits, where it doesn't feather, it doesn't spread. I mentioned the lighter tones, so it does shade. Look at smog, where it really shows some of those red undertones coming through. Part of the S is darker. It's the end of the S into the M that gets a bit darker, starts to go a little more towards the brown, where most of the rest of that writing is red. Now against on the first line, or on the second line, where the A and the beginning of the G are lighter and a bit more red, the downstroke of that G gets darker and brown, back to a lighter and red at the AI, and the NST at the end, well, dark and brown. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does not show those red undertones. It does shade. Take a look at scent on the second line, where the SEN is lighter than the T, which is much darker. Vapor on the third line has a lighter VA, a very dark P, and the or at the end, or hour at the end, much lighter. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine, darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, does shade, does show some of those red undertones coming through. The shading could be enough to perhaps overcome what's happening when you look at the writing. It might make you happy. Take a look at overcome on the first line, where the O is lighter than the VE, which get quite a bit darker and show more of the brown. The R lightens up a little bit. The COM start to get a little bit darker. The E at the end gets much darker. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium nib. About the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, does shade just a tiny bit, little spots of it here and there, little pepperings, if you will, like the cross of the T in with that dot of that I, the last S of cleverness. There's a little bit that's going on. Really showing the red undertones, looking much more as a red ink here, though, and not being my favorite for that reason. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, so we can easily continue our notes back here.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is a little bit darker than it was with the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, does shade, I think, a little bit better than it did on the Clairfontaine. There is no look of any of the red coming through here. It's looking absolutely fantastic. Take a look at, for instance, he said on the third line. He is very dark, where the S of said lightens up quite a bit. The AI get darker. The beginning of the D lightens up a little bit, but that downstroke of the D much darker. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine, darker than it was on the Clairfontaine, really coming through as a very dark, rich brown here. No feathering, no spread, no shading, just great performance. Looking at the medium nib, it is a little bit lighter than it was with the wet fine, darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. There is no feathering, there is no spread, there's almost nothing for shading. Really, it's practically the same tone, the occasional lighter or darker letter, but it is all very distinctively a brown. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does feather a tiny bit. You can see on just a couple of spots like the D, both D's of doctored on the first line, or the ME of time on the third line. It doesn't spread. It does have a couple of moments of shading, but the biggest thing to me here is that it is very much brown, affected by the tone of the paper, and for the best in this case. Looking at the back of the page, you can see just how deep this ink was getting into the paper, especially during a cup, when it feathered just a tiny bit, but you can see it's deep into the page. Mostly you couldn't write on the back of this page, and in fact, it bled through in a couple of spots on the page underneath. Though they're tiny spots, they are there. Just something to be aware of.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, it does shade just as well as it does on the Clairfontaine, doing it properly. Looking at properly on the first line, where the PRO at the beginning are a nice uniform mid-tone. The per right in the middle darken up a little bit. Now it lightens just a little as it heads towards that L, but the LY at the end are very dark. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine, quite a bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, does not shade, does look like a very beautiful, dark, rich brown. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine, a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, it does shade. I think the shading comes through better here than it did on the Clairfontaine. It's just that it's more noticeable, even with the quadrule in the background, which fades away entirely. It doesn't become uncomfortable. Take a look at uncomfortable on the third line, where the uncom in the beginning is a nice lighter tone for what we're getting. The F starts to darken up a little bit into that OR. The table at the end is mostly dark, but the A is light in the middle of it. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. Most noticeable thing here is that the red undertones that were coming through on the Clairfontaine aren't really as strong here. They are here, just not as strong. There it looked much more like a red. Now, shading, it shades just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, at least for my thinking, looking at thinking on the first line, where most all of the word is one tone, but that H does darken up just a couple of shades. Not anything to be regretting in any way. Taking a look at regretting on the second line, where most of the word one tone, but that G is quite a bit darker. Same with the second T, the N into the G at the end. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Ackerman, their number 22. Here is Diamine Macassar. Here is Monteverde Scotch Brown. Here is Pen BBS number 135.
The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is just as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine, though it is showing more of the red undertones that we didn't have there. Now, it doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it does shade. If you're listening to me, you can see listening on the third line, which makes no sense to say you can see it if you're listening. But on listening, you can see that the list at the beginning is pretty light. The 10 in the middle darkens up a little bit, and the ing at the end lightens again. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine, a little bit lighter and flatter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade just a little bit, fluttering through. Take a look at fluttered on the third line, where the F is pretty dark. The LU lighten up a little bit. The TTE a little bit darker, where the RE and beginning of the D lighten up a little bit. It's the end of the D that gets quite a bit darker. Unfortunately, here we are still seeing some of that red undertone coming through a little bit stronger, and something a student might want to be aware of if they didn't mean to have this tone on the page. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does have some light shading going on. The shading is noticeable in darker spots. Things like dots of I's, crosses of T's, commas, not hugely in the writing in itself. The most noticeable thing to me is that the red undertone doesn't seem to be coming through as much here as it was with the wet fine. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, same tone as the Clairfontaine, which is very red leaning, not so much a brown. Now, it does not feather and it does not spread. It does manage, even with the lighter tone, to stand out against this quad rule. It does shade, but it does let me down in the tone that I'm seeing. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting. We can easily continue our notes back here.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page.
Here is Sailor Kobe number 30. Here is Noodler's Pushkin. Here is Zenzoi Juicy Orange. Here is Jeherban Blue Nuit.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather and it does spread. It does have a little bit of shading. Let's take a look at if this is usable. And for the most part, I would say yes, even though the feathering might seem a bit excessive at points like on Magical, that L at the end, but it's very readable. It is copy paper. I think if you were using a drier pen like this with this ink on here, it would be okay. It's still coming across as a brown, where some people don't like red for correcting papers. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine, darker than it was on the Clairfontaine, very brown, no showing of any red here at all. Does it feather? Incredibly, almost to the unusable point. Understanding that we're looking at copy paper, it spreads. Sure, the spread's under control. It's the feathering when we look at understanding on the second line that is just horrible and makes this look like another language. Look at language also on the second line. Those feathers are coming out like messengers on the third line, telling you don't use this ink on this paper. Looking at the medium nib, it is a little bit lighter than it was with the wet fine. Little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather and it does spread. I find it much more usable here with the feathering and spread than it was with the wet fine. That wet fine was unusable. This falls into that. It's serviceable. Most people might not think too much about it. Your fountain pen users are going to go, that's gross. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium, a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. Yes, it feathers. Yes, it spreads. No, it does not shade. Yes, it looks much more like a red ink than it does a brown ink. It's got kind of a maroon look to it. And I don't mind maroon. Reminds me of back when I was a child, speed skating. But I don't want my brown inks to look maroon. So this is horrible for on this paper. Looking at the back of the page, you can see that you could not continue your notes on the back of the page unless you wanted to destroy both sides. However, nothing bled through touching the page underneath.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper. The soft fine gives a good mid-tone with the best shading here. Now, the wet fine is the darkest tone with almost no shading. The medium is just a bit darker than the wet fine, but shades a little bit. The broad is the lightest tone, shades, and it really brings out those red undertones. So I really prefer this in its darker tone, even though it doesn't shade leaving my choice towards a wet fine or a wet medium. However, I hate the red undertones excuse me, coming through, and I would avoid a broad nib.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.